The horror genre of fiction has a habit of being pretty meta, as opposed to genres like fantasy, science fiction, and romance, which all take themselves pretty seriously, especially science fiction, which I guess is because sci-fi is often about big political ideas and social allegories. But why? Why does horror get so meta? And what is it for? My biggest assumption with regards to why is because horror is often not taken seriously by the culture at large. These days in cinema we famously have the phrase elevated horror, which is a silly term that implies that there are some horror films that are more serious than others, that should be taken more seriously by critics and award ceremonies and people in general. It speaks to a bit of paranoia, the idea that people who created and use the term elevated horror know and are self-conscious about the fact that horror for decades and decades and decades has often been seen as silly, as goofy, as just pure entertainment, like there's anything even wrong with that. And I think that's probably where the concept of meta-horror has come from, kind of the same place as elevated horror. If you look at films like Cabin in the Woods, which I think is a fantastically smart film, that pokes fun at the tropes of slasher films, it's always slasher films, and gives a half funny, half clever reasoning behind why there are these specific rules and tropes with regards to the slasher genre. And the most famous example of meta-horror is the Scream franchise. What's funny about that is Scream was created by one of the very people that put slasher fiction on the map. The creator of Nightmare on Elm Street in the 80s, Wes Craven, also created Scream. So who better to create the best work of meta-horror than one of the people who made one of the best works of slasher horror a decade before? But Scream is interesting because it still remains a very good example of its genre. It's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, and the characters make reference to horror stories and to tropes. A great example is in Scream 2, when a few characters in a classroom sit down and discuss the concept of sequels, and discuss what the best sequels are, and examples of sequels that were better than the original, while they are in a sequel that obviously they hope will be even better than the original. It's tongue-in-cheek, but it does not detract from how good Scream and Scream 2 are as slasher films. They're still a lot of fun. So you can take them seriously as a work of art, as a work of cinema, and also remark at how clever some of the meta stuff is. Meta humor and meta concepts are sometimes, irrespective of their genre, the entire point in and of themselves. But Scream is not doing that. It's just sprinkling some meta commentary and meta humor in, without making any kind of distinct point about it. Scream 3, in my opinion, isn't very good, but Screams 4 and 5 also do this really, really well, and have moved with the times, especially in the 5th Scream film, which is just called Scream because in and of itself it's making fun of the concept of reboots, despite being a direct sequel, and it is the 5th Scream film. That sentence was too long, I've lost my train of thought. The 5th Scream film updates itself and makes fun of elevated horror right at the beginning. That's the point I was going to make. So if we take Scream as an example, in my opinion, meta-horror is at its best when the meta-concept is just sprinkled in. Meta, in this sense, being something that just shows a bit of self-awareness and irony. A film that almost knows that it's a film, or at least a film that understands the genre that it's in, and makes a few jokes about that. But it remains a good story if you were to remove the meta elements. And that brings me to this novel, The Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix. I recently got done with this, and it is a piece of meta-horror. In case you don't know what a final girl is, it's one of the most famous tropes of slasher horror. If you go back to the 70s, 80s, and 90s, slasher horror often ends with a girl. The last survivor of the massacre is a girl. Not only that, but she is usually a stereotypical type of girl. She's a good girl. She's the responsible one. She's usually a virgin. These elements are poked fun of in the aforementioned Scream and Cabin in the Woods. In this, what you have is a collection of final girls. Now they are middle-aged women who have been doing a support group led by a famous psychiatrist for years and years. Every so often they meet at a designated time and place, and they have a kind of therapy support group about the fact that they all survived massacres in the 80s and 90s. And to make matters worse, each of their stories inspired a film franchise. And in this, Grady Hendrix is basing all of the film franchises in the novel off real film franchises. So one of the girls in here survived a kind of meta massacre that was heavily inspired by Scream and is called Stab. And that's funny because in Scream 2 onwards, Stab is a film franchise within the Scream film franchise. So it's meta upon meta upon meta. But just like Scream, none of that really detracts from how good of a story this is. In fact, it enhances it because, like in Scream 2 and Scream 5, I think, the concept of the slasher and the final girl and how famous these things are and how they create film franchises is part of the narrative and part of the characterization of these people. So the meta textual elements of the book are important aspects of the plot. They are elements that drive it forwards. So you've got a group of final girls who are all traumatized, who are all uniquely different people, and one day at the very beginning of the story, one of them doesn't show up, and we soon learn that she's dead. On top of that, you've got a new final girl, which I guess could represent the resuscitation of the slasher genre in recent years. Jordan Peele's Us is arguably a slasher. I recently watched the Terrifier 1 and 2 films, which are two of the grossest, most disgusting, and most brilliant slasher films I've ever seen in my life. In fact, slashers aren't often scary, they're fun, and the Terrifier films are, as the title suggests, quite terrifying. So slashers had a little bit of a renaissance, and the fact that in this book you have a new young final girl of a new generation is probably poking at that. So you've got a new final girl, you've got a old final girl who has died, and so you must have a killer who is killing off final girls. And immediately I thought, well, who will be the final girl? So there are fun layers to this in a metatextual sense, but it doesn't get muddy, it doesn't get silly, because just like with Scream, Grady Hendrix is focused on writing a really compelling story, and most importantly, a compelling protagonist. Our protagonist is Lynette Tarkington, who some people call a fake final girl, because she's the only final girl in the support group who didn't kill the killer. In fact, she was left hanging. I'm not going to spoil it, it's quite horrible. And so some people say she's not even a final girl, because she doesn't meet all of the criteria. But she's the only one who is super duper paranoid. If you've seen the new Halloween trilogy, Halloween, Halloween Kills, and Halloween Ends, in those films, Laurie Strode, Jamie Lee Curtis's character, is now a grandmother and a very, very paranoid person who has been training her kids to survive slashers, who lives in a fortress, and is an expert in certain defense stuff. And that's kind of what Lynette is in this. Her home is very protected. She's paranoid. She lives a very secluded life. And she's the one who's taking this seriously. She's the one that we will follow. She is a first-person present tense narrator. We live very deeply in her mind in the present tense, and we go along this journey with her as it unfolds. Beautifully written character, very, very nicely constructed. Not so much in terms of her backstory or her personality, but the things that she does within the novel. The things that she tells other people. The choices that she makes. The mistakes that she makes repeatedly. She fumbles, she makes mistakes. She's kind of stupid and incompetent, but takes herself very seriously. She's angry, she's aggressive, she's impatient, while also being paranoid, and those two things don't fit together very well, but of course they do, because we are confusing things, and so it still works narratively. She's a very compelling protagonist, and what you have here is a kind of slasher about slashers, a thriller about thrillers, a horror book about horror fiction, while, like Scream, remaining a very compelling narrative in its own right, to the point that if you don't know much about slashers, If you aren't a big fan of horror films, you're still going to enjoy this as a novel. It doesn't exclude its audience. It doesn't gatekeep anything. This is still a book that is worth reading because the meta concepts feed its narrative rather than being the entire point. That's what I like about meta as a concept in horror, is that it shows that horror is very self-aware. It has a legacy that it's proud of, and it likes to poke fun of while also paying homage to, but it remains at its core a creative avenue. A place where you can build upon themes, build upon your legacy, create new things. It's kind of like Nintendo. I love Nintendo video games. And there are people out there who always say every Zelda game is the same, every Mario game is the same, every Metroid game is the same. But it's about refining a formula. It's about creating something that is so pure and perfect and constantly improving on it, never resting on your laurels, always growing, always developing. And that's kind of what so much horror is. There are tropes, there are lazy aspects that get leaned on, but they're always at their most fun when those aspects get twisted, where questions are asked and answers are created, where a story is self-aware, and it uses that self-awareness to enhance its narrative, its characters, and create something bold and new, and that's exactly what the Final Girl support group is. It's a really exciting thrill ride that has fun with its meta text. I definitely haven't answered the question, why? Why is there so much meta in horror? I mean, maybe I have, but I'm not entirely sure that I know. But what I do know is that I enjoy it. I do think that the meta aspects of horror help to enhance it narratively, character-wise. It helps to know that there are formulas, and those formulas are going to be enjoyed by new filmmakers, authors, video game developers, and they're going to be enhanced and they're going to be made fun of, because horror, in that sense, feels like a community of people who understand themes and ideas and character traits and tropes, and are excited to make new art, bold new ideas. And that's exactly what this is. This is a bold new idea that really has fun with the legacy that led to it. But Grady Hendrix, first and foremost, is creating a very clever horror novel, a very impactful thriller, and a really, really well-crafted protagonist. Thrillers are famous for having one-dimensional, cookie-cutter characters. That's a hard phrase. But Lynette Tarkington is an exciting, three-dimensional protagonist. Grady Hendrix is enhancing the genre while paying homage to it, just like Scream did. This is very, very cool. So check out the Final Girl support group and go watch some slasher movies. And subscribe for books.